The first settlers started to arrive in New Zealand at the beginning of the 19th century, but for decades Britain tried to avoid any formal commitment because it would involve a lot of cost for not much gain as they saw it. And in 1839 Britain made the decision that it ought to have a treaty with New Zealand to formalise its relations with the indigenous population, and so that it could implement its justice system over its subjects living in the country. And of course that treaty was signed in 1840. The whole treaty really orbits around the issue of sovereignty. That's the central focal point. In the 80s, historians and others began to look more closely at the translation, and they found that there was some quite significant discrepancies. In Article 1 of the English version, for example, all sovereignty goes to the Crown. In Article 2 of the translated version, sovereignty, chieftainship remains with the chiefs. So there's full sovereignty goes to the Crown in the English version, but there's a residue that seems to remain with the chiefs in the translated version. And this led to the view that the two versions are irreconcilable. And because of that, the obligation for the tribunal and the courts was to determine what the principles of the treaty are, because the meaning of the texts themselves couldn't be reconciled between this translated version and the English version. So in August 1839, Britain formally recognised Maori sovereignty. It had to, because these treaties could only be signed between sovereign states. It was governed by international law, and it was a fairly conventional colonial treaty for the era. Nowadays, though, the treaty is an internal agreement within a single sovereign state. So the case has been made by some people that technically speaking it's not even a treaty anyway. But what it's been shown generally to be is an agreement that's fairly malleable, that can be shaped and reshaped to fit the circumstances of the time, and it's quite possible in another generation or two it'll have a completely different application and meaning from that which it has now. What was interesting is in the late 90s and into the early 2000s, there's a great deal of research being done on the origins of the document, on precisely what Britain expected from it, what its senior officials and politicians wanted, and that threw up a completely new complexion. Suddenly you see, actually, Britain didn't want to govern everyone in the country. They only wanted to govern the settlers living here. They wanted to leave Maori sovereignty intact, and that's quite a radical shift from what had happened in the 80s and 90s in terms of scholarship. So there was this dramatic revision of what Britain wanted from the treaty, and that gave sense to a lot of the text that otherwise people couldn't quite explain. So up until that time there were two versions. They just sort of chafed on contact. Now through extra scholarship you can see actually there's a great deal of harmony and consistency between the two versions. What's apparent from organisations that adopt treaty principles and weave them into their practice is that everyone gains, that everyone's better off. It's a sense of mutual benefit by implementing treaty principles. So no one's worse off, but the organisation as a whole functions better, it has more input, it has perhaps hapu or iwi involvement, tangata whenua involvement in decision making and so on. And this has been the case throughout the country. If you look at what's happening with councils, with various government departments, that's precisely the experience, the sense of mutual benefit by adopting treaty principles. There's a difference between treaty settlements and treaty resolutions. And you can use the analogy of a divorce. If you get divorced, you can settle the divorce and legally it's done. But you don't necessarily get a sense of resolution out of that. So a lot of the anguish that you experienced remains with you. Dealing with that is a much more complex process. And a very similar situation happens with treaty settlements. You can say this is a full and final settlement, sign on the line, and it's done. The Crown no longer has an obligation for that piece of land or that claim. But getting rid of the sense of grievance is quite different. And if there's a sticking point, something which causes people to say, well look, despite this, we still feel we cannot get over that hurdle. The sense of anguish, pain, the deep sense of injustice is still there, then that needs to be revisited. There's no good mechanism for this, by the way. It's not an easy solution. And there's all sorts of cross currents of interests and issues of rights and so on that come into it, and of course politics. But it does highlight that difference between settling an issue and resolving it. My name's Paul Moon and I teach history at AUT.